Imagine you're standing in front of a giant red button right now, and pushing it would completely randomize your citizenship.
Oh, wow. Okay.
Yeah, just totally wiping your current passport and assigning you a brand new one from anywhere on the globe, weighted entirely by global population data. My question to you is, would you press it?
I mean, for anyone listening to us right now, pressing that button would likely represent an incredibly dangerous gamble, like
Hmm.
almost unthinkable,
Right.
because the statistical probability of ending up in a situation with fewer rights, less economic security,
Mm.
and, well, compromised physical safety is overwhelmingly high.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because that hesitation, that immediate dread you might feel at the thought of randomizing your birth, that is the core of our mission for this deep dive.
It really is the perfect starting point.
We're taking a massive stack of philosophical and economic source material and pointing it at one very uncomfortable question. Is global inequality a moral scandal, or is it just, an unavoidable baked-in fact of human existence?
Yeah, and this isn't just theoretical.
Exactly. We are talking about the hidden architecture of the world you live in, how resources flow across borders, and what, if anything, we actually owe to people we will literally never cross paths with.
It's a question that demands we look at the mechanics of our world with a very cold, analytical eye. Because on the surface, the idea that inequality is just an inevitable fact, well, it holds a certain pragmatic weight, right?
Right, because the world is messy.
Exactly. Differences in geography, natural resources, historical development, all of that means that complete parity between every human society is likely impossible. But the central tension we need to explore today is the threshold.
The tipping point, basically.
Right. We need to determine if there's a point where the gap between the most secure and the most vulnerable becomes so vast and so deeply entrenched by global systems
Yeah.
that calling it an inevitable fact is no longer an observation. It's an ethical failure.
We're looking for that exact line where a fact becomes a failure. And to find it, we need to strip away all the complex geopolitical jargon, the trade agreements, the GDP metrics, all of it. We have to go all the way back to the starting line.
The very first second of a human life.
Yeah. The thought experiment that opens this whole discussion requires us to envision two children born at the exact same moment. They draw their first breath simultaneously.
But that is where the equality permanently ends.
Because one child is born into a highly developed, wealthy nation. From that very first breath, the environment is engineered for their survival. Like there is sterilized equipment, immediate neonatal care if something goes wrong, a guarantee of clean drinking water.
And it just cascades from there.
It totally does. They're born into a system that provides a structural safety net. Public education, legal rights, digital connectivity, political stability. The machinery of their society is actively working to keep them alive and propel them forward.
Right. And then you have to contrast that with the second child, born in that exact same minute, but in a fragile state. For this child, every single baseline requirement you just mentioned is insecure.
Just a roll of the dice.
Exactly. Clean water might be a daily logistical challenge. Medical care is scarce or maybe prohibitively expensive. The physical environment might be compromised by conflict, and the state infrastructure is simply, not capable of providing a safety net.
It can't guarantee their survival, let alone upward mobility.
No, not at all. The
Right.
machinery just isn't there.
What makes this comparison so difficult to sit with, honestly, is the complete absence of agency. Neither of these infants earned their starting position. They didn't, fill out an application form for their respective countries.
Right, they didn't negotiate for their parents' social class.
Exactly, or pick a passport from a catalog.
These are defined in the literature as the moral accidents of birth. And it is a profound philosophical challenge because these arbitrary variables over which a human being exercises absolutely zero control, they end up heavily dictating their entire life trajectory.
It's staggering when you really think about it.
It is. The geographic coordinates of your birth reliably predict your life expectancy, your lifetime earning potential, your vulnerability to preventable diseases, and, well, just the overall horizon of choices you'll be allowed to make.
It's like starting a massively complex video game, but someone else permanently locked in your difficulty setting before you even looked at the screen.
That's a great way to visualize it.
And for some, it's set to casual mode.
Yeah.
You have a detailed map, extra lives, abundant resources, and the environment is generally forgiving of your mistakes.
But for others,
For others, it is instantly locked on impossible mode. You spawn with no armor, the environment is actively hostile, there are zero save points, and you have to expend all your energy just trying not to get eliminated in the first level.
that analogy perfectly illustrates the friction between our societal ideals and reality. I mean, if we operate on the foundational belief that all human beings are of equal moral worth, which is a premise most modern societies claim to hold, how do we logically justify a global framework where extreme deprivation is determined by the geographic server a person spawns into?
We really can't, can we? We've built this massive global narrative around meritocracy.
Yeah, the idea that effort and talent yield reward.
Right, but the lottery of birth reveals that the foundation of the game board itself is inherently unmeritocratic. We love the idea of the self-made individual because it's comforting. It tells us our successes belong entirely to us.
But this thought experiment forces you to admit that before you ever applied your work ethic, you were handed a massive structural head start simply by falling on the correct side of an invisible line drawn on a map.
Which brings us to a critical juncture, because if we acknowledge that this geographic lottery exerts a massive force on human outcomes, well, we have to precisely define the outcomes we're actually looking at.
Right. When we use a term like global inequality, we risk flattening a highly complex dynamic into a simple binary of rich nations versus poor nations.
And the reality is way more intricate than that.
Much more. The source material breaks this down into three very distinct layers. The first layer is the most visible, the most visceral one. It is the inequality between individuals on a global scale.
Just person to person.
Exactly. This is the contrast between a single person who commands billions of dollars in assets, possessing total economic invulnerability, and another individual who lives in severe, absolute poverty, facing daily food insecurity and lacking basic shelter.
It's the extreme ends of the human experience measured against one another, regardless of where they happen to live.
Right. Then we zoom out to the second layer, which is inequality between countries. This isn't about individual bank accounts anymore.
This is about state capacity, right? National infrastructure.
Yes. We are comparing a nation equipped with expansive, paved highway systems, highly resilient power grids, advanced research hospitals, and a massive tax base to a nation where the government simply cannot collect enough revenue to build a reliable sanitation system.
Or maintain a functional judicial system. It's the disparity in the collective machinery of different societies.
Precisely. But the third layer is where the traditional narrative really gets scrambled. Inequality within countries.
Right, because national wealth doesn't automatically mean universal prosperity.
Exactly. This layer acknowledges that a highly developed, incredibly wealthy nation can still house severe, systemic poverty just miles away from its financial center.
We see that all the time.
And conversely, a developing nation with a low overall GDP can harbor an elite class possessing staggering, globally competitive wealth.
So we aren't looking at a simple divide at all. We're looking at a hyper-complex matrix. You have wealthy individuals in poor states, poor individuals in wealthy states, and massive structural gaps between the states themselves.
It's a very tangled web.
So this forces a very specific question. If the board is this complex, what exactly are we trying to fix? Are we upset because people aren't equal, or are we upset because people are suffering?
To isolate the actual moral failure, we have to look at the World A versus World B thought experiment from the text. Let us construct World A first.
Okay, I'm ready.
In this scenario, every single human being possesses the exact same standard of living. It is a modest standard. There is no extreme wealth, no luxury, but there is also no absolute poverty.
So everyone has just enough to meet their basic needs, and everyone is perfectly equal.
Yes. Now construct World B. In World B, the absolute poorest person is measurably better off than anyone in World A. The baseline of human existence has been raised for everyone.
Okay, so a higher floor.
Right, but World B also contains astronomical disparities. While the poorest have their basic needs met and then some, the wealthiest possess fortunes that dwarf the rest of the population. There is zero poverty, but there is massive, sprawling inequality.
So if you ask someone which world is better, instinctually, I think a lot of people might point to World A because fairness just feels good.
It appeals to our sense of symmetry.
Yeah. But mathematically, World B is superior for every single person. I mean, even the poorest person in World B is glad they aren't in World A.
This introduces a framework known as sufficientarianism.
Sufficientarianism, okay.
The sufficientarian argues that the primary moral scandal of our real world is not the gap between the top and the bottom. The scandal is deprivation.
The lack of sufficiency.
Exactly. If everyone has sufficient access to food, healthcare, housing, and education, the fact that a billionaire exists across town is morally irrelevant. Under this view, extreme inequality is only a problem if it coincides with absolute poverty. The goal of justice, therefore, is simply ensuring everyone has enough.
I understand the mathematical logic there, I really do. If my needs are fully met, why should I care what someone else has? But this feels like it ignores human psychology, and more importantly, it ignores how the real world actually functions.
How so?
Well, isn't there a threshold where extreme wealth inherently damages the system, regardless of whether the baseline needs are met? Think about it this way. If I have a small, functional dinghy and my neighbor has a massive mega yacht, sufficientarianism says I shouldn't care.
Right, because your dinghy floats. You have enough.
Exactly. But what happens when my neighbor uses his mega yacht wealth to buy the entire marina? What happens when he changes the zoning laws to ban dinghies from the water, or buys the only fuel dock and quadruples the price?
Ah, right.
At a certain point, his extreme wealth becomes extreme power over my life. His yacht's weight constantly capsizes my dinghy.
That is a highly effective illustration of the counter perspective, which the text calls the relational argument. Critics of the sufficientarian view argue exactly that wealth does not exist in a vacuum.
It's active.
Very active. Extreme inequality matters fundamentally because of how it distorts human relationships and the structure of society itself.
It's about capture. It's about someone having enough leverage to rewrite the rules for everyone else.
What's fascinating here is that the relational argument posits that extreme economic inequality inevitably mutates into unequal political power, unequal bargaining power, and ultimately domination.
Domination. That's a strong word.
But accurate. Let's look at World B again. Everyone has enough to eat, yes. But what if a fraction of a percent of the population controls the media algorithms, funds all the viable political candidates, owns the primary means of communication, and dictates the labor laws?
Then my life in World B might be comfortable, but I am entirely at their mercy. Like, I have calories, but I don't have autonomy. I have no actual voice in how my society is run.
That is the core of the relational critique. It suggests that justice requires more than just poverty alleviation. It requires safeguarding human dignity and democratic standing.
We can't just feed people and call it a day.
Right. If a segment of the population possesses so much capital that they can essentially purchase the regulatory apparatus of the state, then the society is unjust, even if nobody is starving in the streets. The moral failure is the existence of domination.
So we have two profound moral failures to navigate here. The failure of extreme deprivation people lacking the basics for survival, and the failure of extreme relational inequality, where wealth becomes a tool for domination.
Both represent severe systemic breakdowns.
And if we know these failures exist globally, and we know humanity collectively possesses the resources to address them, the immediate question is, why don't we? What creates this massive disconnect between our moral ideals and our global reality?
It's a huge question.
And I think a lot of it comes down to physical geography. Like, does the sheer distance between us and the suffering person give us an ethical pass?
The ethics of distance is one of the most heavily debated concepts in this field. To test our moral intuitions about geography, we can look at a classic philosophical scenario involving a drowning child.
Okay, set the scene for us.
Imagine you're walking through a park on your way to a very important meeting. You see a small child drowning in a shallow, decorative pond. You can easily wade into the water and pull the child out. But doing so will ruin your expensive shoes and make you late for your meeting, incurring a modest personal cost.
I mean, I think almost anyone listening to this would agree that you have an absolute non-negotiable moral obligation to wade into that pond. Choosing your shoes over a child's life would be monstrous.
The intuition is virtually universal. But the challenge is to change the variables. Imagine that same child is not in a pond 50 feet away from you. Imagine that child is facing a life-threatening, yet easily preventable crisis, perhaps severe malnutrition or a lack of basic vaccines.
But they're thousands of kilometers away on another continent.
Exactly. Furthermore, imagine that through effective, vetted institutions, you could save that child's life at the exact same modest personal cost. The cost of the shoes. Why should the introduction of physical distance nullify the moral obligation?
Because it is the exact same life and the exact same cost to me. The only variable that actually changed is the geographic coordinates of the crisis.
This perspective is the foundation of the cosmopolitan idea. The cosmopolitan argues that human beings possess moral worth simply by virtue of being human, entirely independent of their nationality, their race, or their location on a map.
Right.
If human suffering demands a moral response when it occurs in your immediate vicinity, that demand does not magically evaporate just because the suffering crosses a national border. The cosmopolitan view insists that our moral obligations must be universal.
That sounds incredibly noble. I mean, it sounds like the highest possible evolution of human empathy. But I have to push back here because humans don't actually operate that way, do we?
We struggle with it, certainly.
It is completely unnatural for us to value a stranger 10,000 miles away the same way we value our own neighbors, our own community, or our own family. We are wired for proximity.
The source material wrestles deeply with that exact pushback. It doesn't dismiss the human instinct for proximity. Rather, it formalizes it into the argument for special duties.
Special duties, okay.
This view contends that a nation is not just a random assortment of strangers who happen to occupy the same landmass. A nation is a deeply intertwined social contract.
We are bound together by systems.
We are. Citizens within a nation pay taxes into a shared pool. They submit to a common set of laws. They fund shared infrastructure. They share collective political and economic risks.
We uphold the institutions that make society function.
Exactly. Because of this intense structural cooperation, the special duties argument states that it is entirely justifiable and perhaps even morally required for a government to prioritize the welfare of its own citizens over the welfare of those outside its borders.
I see the mechanics of that. I pay into the system, so the system owes me its primary attention. But we have to ask if the special duties argument frequently acts as a convenient, sanitized alibi for ignoring extreme global suffering.
It absolutely can be used that way.
It's like saying, I am very busy maintaining the homeowners association in my gated community, so I simply cannot be expected to care that the neighborhood across the highway is literally burning to the ground. Yes, we have a social contract with our fellow citizens. But can sharing a tax bracket with someone really justify turning a blind eye to the preventable death of someone else? Does the right to well-paved domestic roads supersede another human's right to malaria medication?
That is the friction point. Even those who heavily champion special duties usually concede that while our strongest obligations might be domestic, we still possess broader, weaker obligations to humanity as a whole.
It's about weighing them against each other.
The debate is over the weight of those obligations, and the tension explodes when these two realms collide. They collide most violently at the concept of borders and migration.
Oh, yeah. Because if geography dictates your life chances, the most logical thing a person can do to improve their life is to change their geography.
Exactly. When we analyze migration through this economic lens, we uncover a staggering reality. A person can instantaneously multiply their economic potential, sometimes by a factor of 10 or more, simply by moving from a developing economy to a highly developed one.
And their inherent skills haven't changed. Their intelligence hasn't changed. Their capacity for hard work hasn't changed.
The only variable that altered was their institutional location. They moved from a system with low capital and weak infrastructure to a system with high capital and strong infrastructure.
Just a different game board.
Right. This proves that a massive portion of the wealth generated by an individual in a rich nation is not purely the result of their own personal merit. It is a premium granted to them by the system they operate within. The text literally describes citizenship in a wealthy nation as a form of inherited wealth.
Calling citizenship inherited wealth completely reframes how we view our own success. I mean, if someone inherits a massive trust fund, society is usually pretty quick to debate whether they actually deserve that money.
We recognize it as unearned luck.
But when we inherit a passport to a wealthy, stable democracy, we almost universally view the economic benefits of that passport as something we earned through our own hard work. We rarely question our absolute right to hold it and exclude others from it.
This is what is known as the border test. If citizenship functions economically identically to inherited wealth, providing massive unearned advantages based purely on the lottery of birth, how do we morally justify violently defending those borders against those who lost the lottery?
Right, why lock the gates?
Defenders of strong borders return to the special duties argument. They say political communities require the ability to control membership in order to maintain the social contract, fund welfare states, and preserve institutional stability. If borders disappear, the institutions might collapse.
But the cosmopolitan critics would counter that closing those borders traps human beings in cycles of poverty that they didn't create and can't escape, solely to protect the unearned inherited wealth of the people inside.
It is a massive collision of rights. A nation's right to self-determination and stability versus an individual human's right to seek equal opportunity and survival.
And that collision forces us to look backward. I mean, if borders heavily dictate our wealth today, and citizenship is an inherited trust fund, we have to ask how those borders and the wealth inside them were drawn in the first place.
We have to talk about history.
Because none of this happened in a vacuum. The global map wasn't just handed down by nature, it was engineered.
The present distribution of global wealth is inextricably linked to historical forces of extraction. We are talking about centuries of empire, colonialism, the transatlantic slave trade, forced resource extraction, and deeply unequal trade relationships enforced by military power.
The messy reality of history.
Yes, the industrialization and rapid economic expansion of many wealthy nations were heavily subsidized by the direct exploitation and destabilization of other regions.
It wasn't just a race where some countries ran faster than others. It was a race where some countries actively broke the legs of the other runners, took their supplies, and used them to build a vehicle to drive to the finish line.
This historical reality fundamentally shifts the moral paradigm. If current global inequality were purely the result of isolated internal choices, if one nation simply innovated better while another nation voluntarily chose a less productive path, the moral obligation of the wealthy nation would be limited.
We could just say, well, we made good choices, you made bad choices, that's just how it goes.
But if the wealth of the advantaged nation is intrinsically connected to the historical subjugation of the disadvantaged nation, the language we use must evolve. The discussion moves away from the concept of charity and enters the realm of repair.
Oh, that's a big shift.
We are no longer asking if rich nations should be generous. We are asking what is owed.
It's like moving into a beautiful, fully paid-off mansion. You live there, you enjoy the nice view, the security, the comfort. But one day, you look at the historical blueprints and you realize the mansion was constructed using materials stolen from the neighborhood across town.
A sobering realization.
Now, you didn't steal the materials. You weren't even alive when the house was built. But you are currently enjoying the ongoing benefits of the theft, while the descendants of the people who were robbed are living in tents in a vacant lot. You may not be the thief, but you are the primary beneficiary of the crime.
That analogy captures the essence of being a structural beneficiary. However, to maintain a rigorous and impartial analysis, we must examine the intense complications of assigning historical blame. History is not a simple, linear ledger.
Because the person living in the mansion feels deeply attacked when you tell them their house is stolen. They say, look, I work 50 hours a week to maintain this house. I didn't oppress anyone.
And they are factually correct regarding their own actions. Modern populations are distinct from historical populations. The individuals currently paying taxes in wealthy nations did not personally orchestrate colonial resource extraction.
Right.
Furthermore, reducing all modern global poverty to a single variable historical European colonialism is analytically flawed. It ignores the agency and internal dynamics of developing nations.
Right. We can't pretend that history is the only active ingredient in today's economy. You can't blame everything on history.
Many former colonies and developing nations grapple with profound internal crises that are not directly dictated by modern foreign powers. We must account for local political corruption, the catastrophic mismanagement of resources by domestic leaders, civil wars driven by internal ethnic or political divisions.
Disease burden, rather.
Yes, devastating disease burdens and challenging geographies, such as being landlocked without navigable bridge. To say that all poverty is solely the fault of historical external actors strips local populations and leaders of their own agency and responsibility.
Okay. I understand the danger of reductive historical blame. If a dictator in a developing nation decides to drain the national treasury to build a golden palace while the citizens starve, that is on him. That is a local failure.
It is.
But how do we reconcile this? Is it really that segregated? Do wealthy nations just watch these local failures from afar?
This is where the concept of shared responsibility becomes vital. The line between local failure and global complicity is heavily blurred. Yes, a corrupt local government may be actively looting its own country's resources, but we must ask, who is buying those stolen resources?
The resources don't just disappear into thin air, they enter the global market.
Exactly. Multinational corporations, often based in wealthy nations, frequently purchase those resources, providing the revenue stream that keeps the corrupt regime in power. Furthermore, when that kleptocrat needs to hide their stolen billions, they do not bury it in the sand.
They need a bank.
They utilize the complex, highly unregulated offshore banking networks and shell companies maintained by the financial sectors of the wealthiest nations on Earth. Or consider geopolitical strategy. Wealthy nations have a long history of actively funding and arming violent dictatorships simply because those dictators align with their strategic or economic interests.
So it is not just a ghost of historical theft. It is active, ongoing, modern complicity. We might point a finger at a corrupt leader failing their people, but external actors are enabling this. Our financial institutions are laundering their money, and our tech companies are eagerly buying the cheap minerals they extract using unregulated labor.
It is a shared ecosystem of exploitation.
If global injustice is this tangled web of historical legacies and modern enablers, we have to look at the actual tools we use today. Like, how do global markets and foreign aid actually function in this mess? Do they help or hurt?
Let us examine the mechanics of global markets first. It is crucial to view capitalism and globalization impartially, as forces that possess immense dual capacity.
Okay.
On one side of the ledger, the expansion of global markets has been arguably the most powerful engine for poverty reduction in human history.
The rising tide lifting boats, right?
Precisely. By integrating developing nations into global supply chains, markets have catalyzed massive foreign direct investment, transferred advanced technology, built infrastructure, and generated hundreds of millions of jobs, pulling vast populations out of extreme, absolute poverty.
But there's a dark side to that ledger. Markets optimize for profit, not for human dignity or long-term structural fairness.
The mechanism of global capitalism relies heavily on capital mobility versus labor immobility. A multinational corporation can move its capital across borders almost instantaneously to find the cheapest possible labor and the most lenient environmental regulations.
But the workers can't move. A worker in a developing nation can't just cross the border to where the wages are highest. They are trapped by the border test we talked about earlier.
This creates an enormous structural bargaining imbalance. A massive corporation with a GDP larger than the host country can approach a developing nation and demand tax exemptions, suppressed wages, and union-busting guarantees in exchange for building a factory.
And if they say no,
If the developing nation refuses, the corporation simply moves to a more desperate country. This creates a race to the bottom in terms of labor rights and environmental protections. The market generates wealth, but the mechanics of the market ensure that the wealth concentrates at the top of the global chain, while the social and environmental costs are heavily externalized onto the poorest populations.
so markets create absolute growth, but they simultaneously accelerate relational inequality. They give people jobs, but ensure they never gain enough power to demand a fair share of the profits.
That's the paradox of the market.
So if markets are this double-edged sword, what about foreign aid? I mean, that is supposed to be our pure, unadulterated mechanism for doing good, right?
The moral imperative behind foreign aid is incredibly strong and logically sound. Wealthy nations possess a surplus of resources. A fraction of that surplus, deployed effectively, can prevent catastrophic human suffering.
Like the drowning child.
Yes, exactly. Funding vaccination drives, providing emergency disaster relief, or distributing anti-malarial bed nets are direct interventions that save millions of lives at a negligible cost to the donor nations.
So it's a no-brainer.
However, the source material warns that we must look past the intent of aid and rigorously analyze its actual mechanics in the field. When aid is poorly designed, or when it ignores the complex realities of the recipient nation, it can become highly destructive.
Wait, really? How does giving away free resources destroy a system?
Consider a scenario where a wealthy nation, heavily subsidizing its own agricultural sector, decides to donate millions of tons of surplus grain to a developing nation facing food insecurity.
Sounds great on paper.
In the immediate short term, people eat. But the sudden influx of free foreign grain floods the local market. Local farmers who cannot possibly compete with free food go bankrupt and lose their land.
Oh, wow. So you feed them this year, but you completely destroy their ability to feed themselves next year. You create a dependency.
Exactly. Furthermore, large-scale financial aid given directly to governments can sever the accountability between a state and its citizens. If a government derives its primary revenue from foreign donors rather than through domestic taxation, it no longer needs to listen to the demands of its own people.
It just answers to the donors.
Right. In this way, aid can inadvertently prop up corrupt, unresponsive regimes, providing them the capital they need to maintain power without developing their own economy. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the moral duty isn't just to give aid, but to ensure the aid actually works.
The ethical duty requires ensuring the intervention builds capacity rather than destroying it. And this dynamic brings us to what I think is the most clarifying yet deeply uncomfortable distinction in this entire subject: the fundamental difference between charity and justice.
It is the conceptual pivot upon which the entire debate rests. Charity is fundamentally rooted in the concept of benevolence and generosity.
I have more. I choose to help.
Yes. The premise is, I rightfully possess this surplus wealth, and out of the goodness of my heart, I am choosing to voluntarily transfer some of it to you to ease your suffering.
So charity leaves the hierarchy completely intact. It assumes the current distribution of power is normal, and it just makes the giver feel virtuous for tossing some crumbs down the ladder.
Justice operates on a completely different paradigm. Justice does not ask, how much should we give? It interrogates the system itself. It asks, why are our respective positions so radically unequal to begin with?
Are the rules of the game fair?
Are the institutions we participate in actively extracting wealth from the very people we claim to be helping?
If we look at this through the lens of justice, the contradictions of the modern world become glaringly obvious, like a wealthy country giving foreign aid while simultaneously exploiting weak labor protections or enabling tax avoidance. That is basically putting a Band-Aid on a wound they are actively causing, right?
It is. A wealthy nation might proudly point to the $2 billion in foreign aid they sent to a developing region. But simultaneously, that same wealthy nation enforces draconian intellectual property laws that prevent the developing region from manufacturing life-saving medicines.
Or they maintain trade tariffs that block them from selling their goods.
Or they tacitly endorse massive corporate tax avoidance schemes that drain tens of billions of dollars in potential public revenue out of that developing nation every single year.
It's like systematically breaking someone's legs every morning and then expecting them to weep with gratitude when you hand them a pair of cheap wooden crutches in the afternoon. Charity focuses on the crutches. Justice demands we stop breaking their legs.
That is precisely the shift in framework the source material is trying to provoke. Responding to immediate suffering requires aid, yes. But structural global inequality requires the dismantling of the systems that generate the suffering. It requires reforming trade laws, enforcing global tax transparency, and shifting bargaining power.
Okay, so we've spent this entire deep dive looking at massive, terrifyingly large systems, colonial history, global capitalism, international institutions. It is very easy to look at all of that and feel entirely paralyzed. But the text doesn't let us hide behind the scale of the problem. It brings the camera right down to the individual listener.
The personal responsibility section.
Yeah. With all these massive structural issues, what is the everyday person supposed to do? What do you personally owe to the people suffering outside your borders?
The material outlines 3 distinct frameworks for personal responsibility. It forces the individual to confront their own position within the global matrix. The first framework is the minimal view.
Let's examine what the minimum requirement for being a good person looks like under this view.
The minimal view argues that your moral obligations are strictly bounded. As long as you pay your legally required taxes, obey the laws of your nation, and refrain from directly physically harming others, your moral duties are fulfilled.
So you aren't actively stealing from anyone, so you're in the clear. Helping is nice, but optional.
Correct. Under this view, if you choose to donate to a global charity, that action is considered supererogatory, meaning it is morally praiseworthy, it is a lovely thing to do, but it is strictly optional.
If you choose to spend your entire disposable income on luxury cars instead, the minimal view says you haven't committed a moral wrong.
I think a massive portion of the developed world lives very comfortably inside the minimal view. It demands nothing structural of us. But then we move to the moderate view.
What changes there?
The moderate view rejects the idea that inaction is morally neutral when you possess the power to prevent severe harm at a reasonable cost. It asserts that citizens of affluent nations have a concrete moral duty to contribute to global poverty reduction.
So it is no longer optional, but it also doesn't demand we bankrupt ourselves.
Right. It asks for a conscientious, sustained effort. This might manifest as a duty to donate a reliable percentage of your income, say 5 or 10%, to highly effective global interventions.
It's a duty to donate at a reasonable cost.
Yes. It also includes civic duties, a responsibility to vote for political candidates who support fair global trade policies, and a duty to advocate for transparent institutions. It requires you to actively participate in repairing the system, but it still allows you to enjoy a comfortable life.
It's a very balanced approach. But then there is the third framework. And when I read this section of the source material, it genuinely forces you to look at your daily life and feel a deep, gnawing friction.
You are referring to the demanding view.
The demanding view is brutal. It does not care about our desire for comfort. The logic is incredibly straightforward. If we agree that a human life has infinite value, And we know that a relatively small amount of money, let's say $3,000, can reliably save a life. How can we ever morally justify spending $3,000 on a luxury vacation?
The demanding view forces every financial decision through a strict utilitarian calculus. It is difficult to justify any luxury spending while that money could prevent severe suffering elsewhere.
It turns buying a $5 coffee into a profound moral crisis. It's like standing in front of a vending machine, but instead of choosing between chips or a candy bar, you're weighing your snack against a vital vaccination for someone across the globe.
Right, because that money could have been sent to an effective charity.
Every time you purchase a new jacket you don't strictly need, you are explicitly choosing your minor convenience over someone else's survival.
The argument is that if we truly believe all human lives have equal moral weight, then any spending above the absolute baseline required for our own basic functioning is essentially a decision to let someone else die. It is mathematically rigid and morally terrifying.
Because humans cannot live like that. If we follow the demanding view to its absolute logical conclusion, we would all have to live ascetic, bare minimum existences. We would be completely alienated from our friends, our culture, our hobbies.
This raises an important question. Just how demanding can morality reasonably be before it paralyzes us? If a moral framework is so intensely demanding that it is psychologically impossible for human beings to actually practice it without breaking down, does it lose its normative utility?
Does it just cause people to give up entirely?
Exactly. It's the friction between what might be mathematically ethical and what is humanly sustainable.
But even if we reject the punishing extremes of the demanding view and settle back into the moderate view, it still requires us to act. We cannot just shrug and say, not my problem. So as we got all these immense concepts together, what is the ideal end state we are striving for? Is global inequality a moral scandal or an inevitable fact?
Based on a rigorous synthesis of the material, the conclusion is a highly nuanced integration of both concepts. Some degree of inequality is inevitable and not inherently unjust.
Due to different choices, risks, and geography.
Yes, the complex interplay of those factors will inherently produce different economic outcomes. Perfect parity is neither practical nor necessarily required by justice. But extreme inequality is a moral scandal when accidents of birth dictate survival,
When wealth translates to domination.
and when avoidable deprivation is allowed to persist.
So what does this all mean? The core thesis here is that we must relentlessly distinguish inequality from injustice. If one society innovates a new technology and can afford nicer infrastructure, that inequality of outcome is not inherently a moral failure. But the unavoidable nature of some inequality can never morally justify avoidable suffering.
The true, piercing question is why any human being should lack the basic conditions for a dignified life in a global system that possesses the capacity to produce such staggering abundance.
It all comes back to a baseline of human dignity. And the material leaves us with questions that you, the listener, have to answer for yourself. How much should birthplace determine a life? Is our duty to end poverty or to reduce extreme inequality? What do we owe people we will never meet?
Those are the enduring questions of global justice, the ones that require ongoing active engagement. But before we conclude, I want to leave you with a brand new thought experiment that builds on the source material's relational argument.
The idea that extreme wealth leads to domination.
Yes, but pushing it into new territory. Imagine a future where artificial intelligence and automation solve all material poverty tomorrow, creating a post-scarcity world where everyone has infinite access to food, water, and shelter.
So absolute poverty is technologically eradicated overnight.
My question to you is this: would we humans simply enjoy that equality, or would we inevitably invent new artificial forms of scarcity,
Like what?
like status, digital real estate, or exclusive biological enhancements, just to maintain the social hierarchies and power dynamics we've grown so accustomed to?
Wow, if we solve the economics of poverty, will we just invent new artificial ways to dominate each other? That is a staggering thought. It asks if the drive for inequality is actually hardwired into our psychology. What an incredible, unsettling place to leave this discussion. We want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive today. Keep questioning the invisible structures around you. Keep examining the inherited wealth of your own position, and we will see you next time.